Good afternoon, friends. Here we are in week 3 with our high school, college, and adult Sunday school. And once again, I'd like to start with a little review of week 2. And as I said last week, repetition is the mother of pedagogy. Last week, I talked about the Gospels and their dating. Professor Dr. Greg Blumberg, professor of New Testament studies at Denver Seminary, is considered one of the foremost authorities of the biographies of Jesus that are better known as the 4 Gospels. Professor Blumberg says it's important to acknowledge that the Gospels are anonymous, but the uniform testimony of the early church is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I used to do that with my Sunday school students. I said, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. With these 4, you can't go wrong. I stole that from a professor, Ben Wetherington III. Well, anyway, they are considered the four writers of the Gospels. Blumberg concludes that there really was no competition as to their authorship, but apparently it just wasn't in dispute. The Synoptic Gospels written by Mark and Luke were unlikely candidates because they weren't among the 12 disciples and they actually never met Jesus. Matthew also was unlikely. Next to Judas, he would have been the most infamous of the 12 disciples because he was a hated Roman tax collector. Only John was the one exception to that, the writer of the 4th Gospel. Not only was he among the 12 disciples of Jesus, but John, along with his brother James and Peter, formed the inner circle of Jesus' disciples. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are referred to as the Synoptics. And the reason they're referred to as the Synoptic is because of their similarity to one another. They were primary sources of historical information concerning Jesus. The 4th Gospel by the evangelist John differs greatly from the Synoptic Gospels. And there are 2 reasons that Blumberg cites for that. It was the relationship of, first, it was John probably knew, because he was writing in the 90s, knew about the other 3 Gospels. And if he didn't have knowledge or total independence for them, there was enough material about Jesus that he didn't overlap much of what the Synoptics were saying. In John 20:21, the evangelist cites, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which were not written in this book." Whether it was first or second position, John's Gospel differed greatly from the Synoptics. That's sometimes a hard word to get out. Synoptics. Say that 3 times. Now I got to do that. Most New Testament scholars date the writing of the Gospels between the late 50s and the mid 90s AD, or if you like, CE, Common Era. Most secular historians today like to use the CE. I prefer the Ada Domini, the Latin. Maybe because I was an altar boy when I was a kid. Mark was also the 1st Gospel written somewhere in the late 50s, early dating to maybe into the late 60s, later dating. Mark recorded his remembrances from the Apostle Peter. Matthew wrote his Gospel early, maybe late 60s, but probably into the 70s, maybe even in the 80s, but probably into that time, the 60s through the 80s. As one of the 12, he would have had first-hand information concerning Jesus. And there was an interesting thing about tax collectors. They had sort of a shorthand. So Matthew could have taken a lot of notes, although both Matthew and Luke contain a tremendous amount of their information they got from Mark's gospel. They just elaborated, both of them elaborated on them. Luke authored the third gospel and also the Acts of the Apostles, which was the history of the early Christian movement. Both probably wrote theirs in the mid-70s to 80s. Luke's gospel is one of the 4 biographies which were written. Acts, his second book, which was the sequel to his gospel, is a history, like I said, of the early church. He was probably a Greek Gentile who accompanied Paul on several of his missionary journeys. Luke is considered one of the fine ancient historians, but like Mark, he never met Jesus, but in his prologue, he states this, that he investigated everything carefully and wrote an account of Jesus' life based on the eyewitness testimonies. Also, much of Mark's gospel, as I said before, can be found in Luke's gospel. And finally, the Gospel of John was composed probably in the middle 90s, a little before his actual death. And he is probably the only apostle that was not martyred for his faith. Although they did try, I believe they threw him in boiling oil, and God just wasn't ready for him in heaven yet. The fourth gospel is ascribed to John the Apostle by early church tradition. John and his brother James, along with Peter, as I said before, were part of the inner circle of Jesus's disciples. Christians may be surprised the existence of Jesus over the years has been challenged from time to time, especially from the 18th century on. A few scholars have stated the belief that Jesus never existed. I don't believe him personally. They claim that the New Testament Gospels were written much too late, probably AD 100 or later. And at that point, they're saying that the early church probably just invented Jesus as a historical figure. They probably read Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code to get that information, which is a bunch of baloney, that's for sure. Dan Brown had a very vivid imagination. He believed that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were actually married and had a daughter named Sophia. And it's actually a very good movie, but still, it's a bunch of baloney. But from the early non-biblical historical records, we can reconstruct the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Nevertheless, the majority of these extra-biblical texts speak of Jesus in a non-complementary term. None of these texts are seeking to prove the existence of Jesus, nor validate his historicity. Isn't that a nice word, historicity? Took me 3 months to learn how to say that correctly. Only kidding. In fact, by their non-complementary writings, these writers of antiquity have chronicled many of the events covered in the New Testament Gospels. But today, most secular historians and New Testament scholars accept the New Testament as a good eyewitness of the account of the historic existence of Jesus. Manuscript evidence in support of Jesus' existence was written by ancient historians like Josephus and Tacitus, and I'll talk more about them later. And it's accepted by almost all professional historians and New Testament scholars. New Testament scholar Craig Blumberg says, back to Dr. Blumberg, there are dozens of non-Christian historical references about Jesus from the 1st century into the 2nd century AD. By far, the most references comes from the Jewish historian Titus Flavius Josephus. I love saying Roman names. They're really, they flow just beautifully. And some even get a 4th name. They were like Josephus was adopted by the Emperor Titus, which would have been probably a little bit like maybe the Emperor Nero. It would have been Titus Flavius Josephus Nero. Imagine hanging that moniker on your newborn kid. Because of the historical proximity to Jesus's life, Josephus' writings are almost near eyewitness, have a near eyewitness quality. Less than a decade after Jesus's crucifixion, Josephus is considered one of the great historians of antiquity. He wrote 2 books. Antiquities of the Jews, which was compiled in AD 93. It was just about the same time that John was writing his 4th gospel. Antiquities traces the history of the Jews from creation to the Jewish revolt against the Romans in AD 66 to 70. Josephus also wrote the history of the Jewish wars. Josephus was drawn, and this is kind of interesting background on Josephus. Josephus was drawn reluctantly into the rebellion, and he was appointed military commander in Galilee. But being the smart man that he was, he soon realized the futility of opposing the Romans, and he arranged a surrender to the Roman commander Vespasian. Appearing before General Vespasian, Josephus did a very smart thing. He assumed the role of a prophet, forecasting that Vespasian would soon become emperor. That won favor with the general. The strategy saved his life, and for the next 2 years, he remained a Roman prisoner. After the death of Emperor Nero in AD 69, Vespasian did become emperor. With Josephus' prophecy coming true, he was given his freedom and became a Roman citizen. From that time forward, Josephus attached himself to the Roman cause. He actually joined Vespasian's son Titus in the siege of Jerusalem starting in 66, and it was captured in 70 AD. Becoming hated by the Jewish rebels for his apostasy, rather like a Jewish Benedict Arnold. Following the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple of the Second Temple, and that is covered in all 3 Synoptic Gospels. Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple in Mark 24, Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21:5. After the Jewish revolt, Josephus moved to Rome, devoting the rest of his life to writing histories under the patronage of first Vespasian and then his son Titus. Because of Josephus' status as a Roman citizen and his Jewish nationality, he was considered no friend to the early Christian movement. But Josephus is considered to be a first-class ancient historian, which lends credibility to his writings. They contain references to Jesus, and that's what makes them important to the early Christian church, or our church today, when we're looking at it historically. Excuse me. In Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus' writings contain two references to Jesus of Nazareth. The first is the most extensive. It states Jesus was the Messiah and a wise teacher who was crucified by Pontius Pilate. It's known as the Testimonial Flavian. The second reference is to Jesus' brother, James, who was, and Jesus in that was called the Christ. Let me talk a little bit about the definition of Christ. Christ comes from the Greek word Christos, which means the anointed one or chosen one. The Hebrew translation of Christ is Messiah. So Christ is a title, not Jesus's last name. When Jesus asked his disciples who they thought he was, Peter answered, "You are the Christ," which was titled, the anointed one, the Son of the living God. That's found in Mark 16:16. Jesus answered, I love this, and this is where Peter is elevated to leader. "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." Then in verse 18, Jesus chooses Peter to lead the Christian church. And I was saying to Peter, and I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. In the Pauline epistles, which are our earliest texts of the New Testament, Paul often refers to Jesus as Christ Jesus or Christ, which is, I believe, is a little less confusing once you know the meaning. It simply is the anointed one, Jesus. Christ, the anointed one, Jesus. Jesus was commonly referred to as Jesus of Nazareth, or the son of the carpenter, or in Aramaic, and boy, I may blow this one, Yeshua bar Joseph. I think that's right. Which translates Jesus, son of Joseph. This was probably how Jesus was most frequently identified in real life, in his Aramaic language, which is the language Jesus spoke and the disciples spoke. And like Jesus, Peter, and this is contained in Matthew 16:17, is referred to as Simon Bar-Jonah, which simply means Simon, son of Jonah. It was a common reference to sons of fathers in those days. But by far, the most frequent reference Jesus called for himself was Son of Man, recorded over 100 times in the Gospels. And I'm going to cover that more at a later Sunday. But I'd like to return to the Testimonial Flavian here, because there are some disputes in this as to its authenticity. It's considered by most scholars that there were something called Christian interpolations, which is just a fancy word for Christian additions to the original document. So what do we know about Josephus's document, minus these Christian additions that are historically factual? Professor and historian Paul Meyer observes, no Jew would have ever claimed that Jesus was the Messiah who rose from the dead without first becoming a convert to Christianity. But here are the important facts that the overwhelming majority of scholars consider authentic in the testimonium. First, Jesus was a wise and virtuous man, no problem there, with a significant following of Jewish disciples. Second, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Third, there were reports he appeared to witnesses following his resurrection. And fourth, some of them claimed that he was the Messiah the prophets had predicted. So I think we're on pretty solid historical grounds claiming Josephus's writings, minus these few interpolations, such as Jesus was the Messiah and that he rose from the dead. In fact, Josephus's writings removes any doubt of the existence of Jesus of Nazareth. This represents the majority view held by scholars today concerning Josephus and the testimonium. Whether scholars were conservative or liberal Christian or Jewish or secular non-believing scholars, the testimonium reflects Josephus' authorship, minus the few interpolations. This position is supported by the majority of scholars from diverse backgrounds, liberal to radical scholars, such as liberal John P. Meyer and much more radical Paula Fredrickson and John Dominic Crossan, to conservative evangelical scholars like F.F. Bruce, Craig Blumberg, and the before mentioned Ben Witherington III, plus just dozens more. The ideological range of these scholars shows the position certainly cannot be dismissed and as showing ideological bias. For example, let's take a comparison between the radical scholar, John Dominic Crossan, and the evangelical scholar, Craig Blumberg. Crossan, a former Irish priest, believes that Jesus was crucified, no different than Craig Blumberg, but taken down off the cross, buried in a shallow grave, his body dug up by dogs and eaten. Not quite what we have in the four Gospels. Whereas Blumberg, professor of New Testament studies at Denver Seminary, believes in the inerrancy of Scripture. You don't get much more diverse in scholarship than that. Between the New Testament and extra biblical accounts, there's no serious reason to doubt the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth. Even the early Christian opponents, the Jews and the Romans, accepted Jesus' existence and wrote about it. He had disciples. They acknowledged that Jesus had disciples, worked miracles, was put to death on a Roman cross. So, what other biblical references concerning Jesus and the early Christian church and the movement of this Christian church? Well, I'm going to talk about that, in 2 weeks, because next week I'm going to divert a little bit and I'm going to talk, because it is Memorial Day weekend, I'm going to talk about Memorial Day, a little bit of its history, and some other aspects of it that will be the follow-up to our great Sunday service. You do not want to miss that. Fernando is preaching, and we are going to be honoring our dear Pastor Ron Camp. So until next week, thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll be talking with you later.